Next we've got dependent personality disorder. This is our next one in the anxious cluster. So these folks really just want to be taken care of. They're not good at fending for themselves. As you'll see from my description in just a minute, I'm guessing that these people would not make good lab partners if you're working together with them on a project. So they tend to be very submissive. So they will take orders, but they constantly seek reassurance. So sort of like we saw with avoidant personality disorder, they lack a lot of confidence in their own abilities. They want other people to tell them that, yes, you're doing a good job, you're doing well, keep it up. They just need this reassurance all the time. It's pretty rare that they will take any kind of initiative and do things for themselves. So again, they really need constant management and constant reassurance. They're also pretty unlikely to disagree with other people. So, as you might imagine from this description, they don't work very well independently. Someone with dependent personality disorder is not going to be able to just get something done on time on their own. And a lot of times what you'll see with these folks is that they might be willing to tolerate some abuse. A lot of times this is emotional abuse in order to gain support from others. So they'll stay in these kind of bad relationships just because they want this reassurance. They really need other people in order to get anything done. And so if this person, for example, had a really bad boss who was kind of a jerk to them all the time, they're very unlikely to say, hey, you know, I'm doing the best that I can. I just need a little more time to get this finished and do it right. They'll just sit there and say, I'm sorry, I'll try to do better. So, incidentally, your textbook has these tables that they provide for each one of these disorders that provides sample statements that you might expect to hear from someone with these things, and it's worth skimming through if you haven't seen that already. They're pretty interesting and informative. So finally, our last disorder of the day. Does anybody have any questions about this one? So our last disorder in the anxious cluster, and the last one we're going to cover today, is obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Now, you may be familiar with obsessive-compulsive disorder, where people have these obsessions. So they might be obsessed with the thought that they might have left the stove on, so they have this compulsion to constantly check to make sure the stove is off, or they might be germaphobes, for example. This one's a little bit different. So these folks are preoccupied with order, which you do see in some types of obsessive-compulsive disorder. They'll be preoccupied with symmetry, for example. And so folks with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder are also likely to be described as being perfectionists. So everything has to be just right. They are usually very devoted to their work. And oftentimes they don't really care much or devote much time to leisure activities or friendships. They don't really have much of a social life outside of work. So one thing that I use to remember what obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is all about, in contrast to just regular OCD, is that these folks are workaholics. Right? And they're more likely than your average person to be pretty miserly and stingy, so they're really tight with their money. And they can be pretty stubborn too. So if you know one of these people and you try to get them to go out and do something and just leave their work behind, it's really hard to do. I've seen, as we go through these things, I've seen a few people indicate some signs that they might know some people with some of these characteristics, but just a word of warning, don't go off diagnosing your friends with these disorders. That's not a good thing to do. All right. So, any questions about any of this stuff so far? All right, so we're going to spend the last part of today's class talking about the prevalence of these disorders and talking briefly about the causes of them. So when we talk about prevalence, we're referring to the total number of cases present in a given population during a period of time. I believe that most of this prevalence data is probably collected from a North American and European population for these disorders. But the most common disorder of the ones that we've talked about is actually that last one, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And this one has just over a 4% prevalence rate. So around 4% of the population at any given time could be diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. And that's actually about twice as common as the second most prevalent personality disorder. So most common by a pretty large margin. All right. So let's see a few people still writing.
Is that across all societies, or just?
Like I said, this is probably based mainly on data from North America and Europe. I don't know that this applies to more like Eastern cultures like India and China or even Africa. Let's see. And that's going to apply to all of this prevalence data that we're talking about. So the next most common disorders are schizotypal disorder, histrionic disorder, and dependent personality disorder. And there's a lot of debate within each one of these disorders as to whether they are categorical in nature. So that was that distinction that we talked about last time of either the person has it or they don't, versus that dimensional view that says that, well, everybody has this characteristic, but these folks just have an extremely high or extremely low level of that characteristic. So schizotypal is one that was mentioned in that talk that I attended on Monday that has been suggested that it might be more categorical in nature, so there's probably a clear genetic component. So for each one of these, the prevalence rate is about 2%, and you can see all of this in your textbook as well. Now, the least common personality disorder is actually narcissistic personality disorder, which I believe is much more likely to be dimensional in nature. As we've talked about, you have a lot of people who are a little narcissistic, but it doesn't really cause a lot of disruption in their lives. And so for this one, it's a pretty low prevalence rate, so 2 out of every 1,000 people at any given time in our population could be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. So the last thing we'll talk about today, and just very briefly because there isn't a whole lot of information here, is relating to the causes of these personality disorders. So, as I mentioned on Monday, this whole field that studies these disorders is called psychopathology. And it tends to be a very descriptive field. So you'll find these people when they already have the disorder, and then the therapists and researchers will try to describe what characteristics need to be in place in order for a person to be diagnosed as having this disorder. So there's much more of a focus on what the disorder is in terms of describing the symptoms and the common behaviors like we did today than why it exists at all. So for just about all of these disorders, the answer to the question, why do people get this, is, well, it's complicated. There are a lot of things that go into it. So there are going to be some biological causes. So there's, like I mentioned, for the schizotypal disorder, there may be some specific genetic factors that influence that. And then sometimes people might just be genetically predisposed to be at the extreme end of one of these spectrums. So like with social anxiety, some people might be genetically predisposed to have not very much. Some people might be predisposed to have more. And of course, as we've talked about, there are always some social causes as well. So the way that a person is, whether you're talking about normal personality traits or disordered personality, results from an interaction between the environment of development and their genes. So to some degree, a lot of these disorders can probably be attributed to social development. You might have noticed that certain things like borderline personality disorder and dependent personality disorder sounded like they might have some in common with those different styles of attachment that we talked about. So there's the insecure attachment styles, and so researchers are trying to investigate whether attachment style has any relationship to these disorders, but that research is kind of hard to do. You have to do those longitudinal studies and follow people over the course of their lives. So, any questions about this stuff? All right, well, that's it for today, and we'll wrap things up with chapter 20 on Friday.